Hello, my name is David Bruce. I have a bunch of your questions from Instagram and Twitter and from my patrons on Patreon to answer. And we're going to cover things like how pieces become part of the classical canon. I'll foolishly attempt to define classical music. We'll talk about what drives me as a composer and the mental health challenges of being a composer. We're also going to ask, could a collaboration with Wintergatan's marble machine be on the cards? And we'll look at the ways that Bach can be a dangerous influence on us composers. And I'll throw in one or two other questions as well. Timestamps to all these questions are in the description, so pull down on that if you want to jump straight to one of those questions. So John Williams asks, in current times, how do works become included into the classical canon? What are some pieces that have made the cut? For example, I think Caroline Shaw's Partita for 8 voices is a landmark piece of the current era. So thanks, John, and we'll actually talk about your namesake in a minute. So the classical canon, and not canon by the way, is the term we use to describe pieces that have made it. You can think of it as a kind of Darwinian survival of the fittest. Only the strongest pieces that really cut through the jungle of noise make it through and become pieces that we all know and love and are regularly played by musicians all over the world. It takes a long time for a piece to truly become part of the canon. And in fact, the canon's constantly changing. It's not like something just enters into masterpiece status and just stays there. Just like any kind of history, our views on which parts of it are important changes over time. But the main thing it does take is time, and so it's pretty difficult to say with any certainty which composer alive today will end up being part of the canon. Caroline Shaw is an American composer whose music has been gaining a lot of attention, particularly since she won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013 for her Partita for 8 voices. I recently went to a great concert of her music by the Lick Quartet here in London, and her music has a real openness that embraces folk and pop music as well as hints of more historical styles. I really like it, but will it be part of the canon in 100 years' time? Well, pieces by composers like Caroline or Thomas Addis or John Adams do already get regularly performed a lot, but can you really say that they've entered the canon yet? I think it's still too early to say for sure. I would say you have to go a bit further back to the works of, say, Shostakovich or something like Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time from the 1940s to find pieces that seem to have found a genuine place in the repertoire, which we can be pretty certain they'll maintain for some time to come. And don't forget, we're probably overlooking some of the best composers right now. It took years after their deaths to rediscover some composers that we now consider central to the canon, whether it's Mahler, whose music was unplayed for a good 50 years after his death, or even J.S. Bach himself, whose music was considered old-fashioned in its day and only really started being revived in the 19th century through championing by composers like Mendelssohn. I'd like to relate this to a question from Mikis, aka C1D. What is classical music or art music? So this is one of those questions that it's kind of foolish to answer. What is classical music? Even the great Leonard Bernstein got it wrong. He gave a lecture on it in 1959.
You see, everybody thinks he knows what classical music is. People use this word to describe music that isn't jazz or popular songs or folk music, just because there isn't any other word that seems to describe it better.
And he went through a list of problematic terms. Not serious music, because plenty of non-classical music is serious. Not art music, because jazz music is just as much art music. And in the end, Bernstein settled on the phrase exact music.
This music is permanent, unchangeable, exact. Now there's a good word, exact. Maybe that's what we should call this kind of music instead of classical. We should call it exact music, because there's only one way it can be played, and that way has been told us by the composer himself.
But already in 1959, and much more in the decades afterwards, many classical composers wrote pieces that weren't exact, that had a number of different ways of playing them, from the chants compositions of John Cage to the aleatoric music by Lutosławski. One thing Bernstein did get right is that the term classical is itself quite annoying, because it refers to both the overall tradition as well as to a particular period within the tradition. Classical music as a whole refers to anything from, say, 1200s, including the music of the Renaissance and the Baroque, through to the Romantic and the modern eras. but it also refers to this period from around 1750 to 1820, known as the classical period. So it's important to be clear, we're talking about the big classical music here, not the smaller classical music. But how can we define it? If classical music is about longevity, about timelessness, does a group like the Beatles become classical music if we still play their music 50 years later? How does that compare to something like this song from Aire by Osvaldo Golijov, which sounds very like pop music but is usually performed in classical concerts? The British composer Anna Meredith writes orchestral pieces for the BBC Proms, but also tours with her own electronica band. So are her band pieces classical music as well in some form? People often ask about film music, which is often written for orchestra, and certainly if you turn on Classic FM you'll hear a lot of film music. So is that classical music? Well, I would say that as things currently stand, no, not really. And not for any intrinsic quality of the music itself, but because it hasn't really become part of the scene, part of the classical community, part of that river of conductors, performers, concert managers, composers. Now I guess that's debatable because I just said film music is played on Classic FM and it does often get played by orchestras, usually in separate standalone concerts. But to me there's a sense that being integrated into the lifeblood of classical music is something different. This is not to say that a lot of this music won't do that. So a lot of classical musicians, for example, have a great deal of respect for John Williams. I really like the score from Catch Me If You Can, for example. And you could easily imagine over time that his pieces start becoming part of the classical repertoire, played in concerts alongside other classical composers, influencing composers, and becoming an integral part of classical music even if they weren't originally. And by comparison, take somebody like Conlon Nancaro, who wrote those crazy player-piano pieces sitting in his garage in Mexico. At the time he wrote them, I don't know if what he was doing was classical music. But it started to become something that people have transcribed, made arrangements of, and has also had a massive cultural impact on a lot of composers who were inspired by his music. So it's pretty easy for me now to think of Nancaro as part of the classical music tradition. One more example, think about how those early minimalist pieces full of marimbas and repetition must have sounded when they first came out. I'm sure people were reluctant to call that classical music at the time. But now it's a fully integrated part of the scene. It's been an influence on generations of composers. Most classical musicians will play it at one time or another. It's clearly a new tributary that has flowed into the main river. And that's how I think of it, a giant river of people, all part of a tradition of classical music stretching back hundreds of years. It's a tradition that changes with time. I don't think there's any set rule as to what a classical piece is, what a classical concert should be, or where it should take place. The classical tradition today is very different from how it was in the Baroque era. And in 200 years' time it could be mostly on amplified guitars and keyboards for all we know. But for it still to be classical music, there would have been this connection and continuity, this flow of people, ideas and music. Nora Kisher Brown asks, how many of the instruments on your wall can you play? Well, all of them, but badly. I do actually test things out on my instruments quite a lot. It comes in so handy for trying out string parts and so on, but I also just really enjoy playing some of them, like I play a bit of out-of-tune bluegrass on my ukulele. And on my most recent edition, a snare drum with hi-hat, I've been working on my Clyde Stubblefield beats. Alex Cannon asks, do you think it's important to know about Bach chorale harmony? So speaking of canons, Bach's chorales are pretty central pieces to the classical canon, and for decades these pieces have been used as a useful tool for understanding one of the foundations of Western music, what's known as common practiced harmony. Bach's original chorales are harmonizations of famous hymn tunes from his day. So the top line, the soprano line, is the tune, and the three parts below are the harmonies he added. So we have these great models to study, and as a student you're usually given that top line and asked to fill in the three parts below. You usually start by figuring out the cadences at the end of each phrase, usually some kind of perfect 5/1 cadence. And then you'll probably work out the bass line for the rest and figure out a series of chord progressions. And then finally you'll fill in the two inner voices. There are various rules you use throughout. A seventh of a chord must always fall, a leading note must always rise, rules to do with the preparation and resolution of dissonances, and so on. And by doing this, you really learn the fundamentals of traditional diatonic harmony. It's sort of the Old Testament of classical music. So if you're a jazz performer or electronic music producer, do you need to know about this stuff? Well, one of the things chorales are really good for is learning about voice leading. Voice leading is a way of making sure that each of those 4 lines is easy to sing. It should try and move mostly by step without lots of awkward leaps. And chords built around good voice leading feel very natural in the way they move from one to the next. They have this kind of smoothness to them. And it's something people think a lot about when they're voicing jazz chords, for example. Especially if you're using a lot of chromatic movement. If each of the notes of the chord slides stepwise into another, that really helps it to feel more cohesive and less jarring.
So Bach is the master of this, right? Bach with his 4-part chorales, where the chords can all be understood vertically and functionally, but every single melody in the chord has momentum and has motion. I guess it's something that as a piano player I have to struggle with a little bit, because at first, as a piano player, it's so easy just to go like bundle of notes, because they're all there in front of you, just waiting to be played. It took a little bit of time just to be courageous enough to not play them all at once. That's something I'm still learning. But I think that when it comes to voice leading, as long as you sit down and concentrate on each note having a place to go, then I think you're safe, because a lot of the most effective voice leading is like chromatic. Triads moving side by side, that's strong. The bass line having a strong motion, that's really strong.
In Bach chorales, voice leading also refers to the way each part needs to have a sense of independence in the way it moves. This is the main point behind the often misunderstood idea of parallel octaves and fifths being wrong. I remember playing parallel octaves and fifths as a student and thinking, well, what's wrong with that? It sounds great. But the idea is that if things are moving together like that in parallel, they're no longer sounding like independent parts. And that's what we're aiming for, each part sounding like an independent line. If you spend some time with Bach chorales, you start to understand how it's made up like a bit of a 3D jigsaw puzzle. Each line has to function as a singable line in its own right, but it also has to fit into this harmonic structure as it goes along. And understanding that will, I think, help you tremendously, whatever kind of music you make. So why did I call Bach a dangerous composer? Well, I think he's only really dangerous for us classical composers. We all have a sense of Bach as being like the pinnacle, the Mount Everest of composers, if you like. His music seems to have this perfect balance and purity. Those melodic and harmonic elements are perfectly integrated. The parts are built from independent lines, and the pieces are built from single ideas, played forwards, backwards, or upside down. It's all pure, balanced, and logical. So because Bach's music is so good, so universally loved, so timeless, it's tempting to think that his is the model we should follow. So if we don't have independent parts, but we happen to like melodies with chordal accompaniments, we must be somewhere further down that mountain range. And if we don't develop everything from one small idea and instead grab things from multiple sources, maybe even multiple cultures, then we're further down still. Bach becomes like a fantasy of purity, and I've seen composers time and again aspiring after his purity and perfection, who end up writing slightly turgid academic pieces which technically are beautifully integrated and beautifully marry the 2D of the melody with the 3D of the harmony, but that emotionally have nothing to say. It's genuinely hard because part of the joy of trying to compose is pitting yourself against the great minds of the past and seeing how far up that mountain range you can climb. But I suppose what I'm saying is that you don't have to do all of those things to be still a really great composer. Debussy, Tchaikovsky, and many others tended to write a melody with a chordal accompaniment, so not all the parts feel independent, and many fabulous composers seem to write really unique pieces despite drawing influences from all over the place. Are these composers further down that mountain range than Bach? Well, perhaps, but they still write really great music, and I think it would be good if some of us were humble enough to aim for these slightly lower but still glorious peaks, instead of freezing to death, starved of oxygen, aiming for Mount Everest. WeezerX5 says, I've got some questions about your great Lick Quartet. How many people involved in the composition, players, commission people, concert hall people, are in group meme? Do they like the idea of something silly like the lick as the basis of a serious piece? And do you discuss things like that beforehand, or do you just deliver a finished piece hoping they'll like it? So thank you so much to all of you who watched the performance of my Lick Quartet in my last video. I've been so happy with the response, so many of you seem to have genuinely enjoyed listening, so thank you. As far as knowing about the Lick, I don't think anyone else involved was really part of group meme. So the commission came through the quartet who I'd worked with before. They're on my recording of The North Wind Was a Woman, and they've played my piece Cymbeline with Avi Avital quite often, so we knew each other quite well. And they were keen to organise a new commission, so their agent set about finding venues that they would be touring to anyway to see if anyone was willing to fund a commission. And they found these two from the Dallas Chamber Music Society and the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. The quartet requested that the piece be about 20 minutes long, which is fairly typical for this kind of piece. And beyond that, there were zero stipulations as to what kind of piece it would be. And that's the way I like it and the way it usually is. As far as whether any of these people minded it being based on the Lick, I certainly don't think so. I think they were more intrigued to hear about this hint of another world here on YouTube that they didn't know much about. So a great question here from Nathan Ray. Do you ever think about how the musicians and performers will look when playing your compositions? Do their physical movements factor into your work? So some composers do write specific spatial layouts or have musicians moving around the stage during the piece. And not just for the change in sound, but for the theatrical aspect. So a piece like Harrison Birtwhistle's Secret Theatre, for example, has two groups, one standing and one sitting, and the players have to move between them during the performance. On the whole, it's not something I'm a massive fan of, especially with classical musicians who are often not used to performing in this kind of way, so it can come across pretty awkwardly. But I do think it's good to be reminded that performance is a kind of theatre. The one physical aspect of performance that often annoys me is the music stand, which if they're not careful, some musicians can end up using as a kind of shield to hide themselves from the audience, which is obviously not ideal. Watching a classical piece played from memory can be incredibly refreshing for an audience. I've seen groups like Eighth Blackbird in the US and the Aurora Orchestra in the UK do this, and they always seem to get a great reaction. Of course, it takes a lot of time and effort to learn a piece, but I wish more new pieces were done from memory. It just allows you to focus much more on the music. Sterling Nykamp asks, what continues to drive your love of music and composing? Well, a love of music is one thing, I guess. It's just something you have or you don't have. But a love of composing is something a bit more complicated because it's quite hard to untangle two aspects. One is the actual act of creation, composing, music making. And the other is what you might loosely call, or pejoratively call, the glamour, the sense that you have of who a composer is and how they fit into society, the fantasy of what it's like to be a successful composer or successful producer or successful music maker. And that's complicated because your sense of what those things are when you first start out isn't very accurate, and it's coloured by who you're trying to impress with that glamour. Because, face facts, if no one was watching, you might still have a love of music, but you wouldn't be aiming for the grandeur of a proms commission or a gig at Madison Square Gardens. These are things you want because there's somebody or some group of people, maybe even some memory of someone, that deep down you're trying to impress. It's pretty hard to be really, really honest with yourself about that, but I do think that you're better off leaving the grandeur chasing at the gate and focusing on the music making. The difficulty for composers like myself is that it's hard to get access to the kinds of players who will perform your music unless you have a bit of a name, a bit of grandeur, which complicates things further because you can tell yourself, I'm only after the grandeur because it's a necessary evil to get my music performed. So for me, attempting to reach those goals, say a proms commission or a main stage opera production, was enough to give me that drive for a long time. And when I did finally get them, only really in the past 5 years or so, there came a moment when I got slightly worried that the grandeur had been my main motivation all along. That having fulfilled those goals, I would be much less motivated to compose. What certainly did happen was that I was much less motivated to care about that career path. It might seem to you like I've had a really successful career, but all the way along, things have felt extremely tenuous as a career. There was just a very thin thread which led from one commission to the next, and always the sense that if I didn't write the next piece, the thread would break and it would all be over. So I suspect I may well have written a few pieces out of fear of losing that thread, rather than because they were things I was passionately keen on doing. And now, having reached those goals, I'm no longer as worried about that thread, and I feel a new freedom to go after musical goals I'm really excited by. I would never in the past have dared to do some of the things I do on this channel for fear of somehow breaking that thread. But now I, quite frankly, don't care how it comes across. I'm just determined to enjoy doing the crazy things with music that I love doing. And the fact that so many of you seem to be enjoying coming along for the ride is just thrilling. So my advice, if you're struggling in some way with outlets for your creativity, is to try to understand genuinely where the centre of your musical passion and excitement comes from, and try to separate it from the false prophet of glamour. Stephen Sellers asks, have you talked much about dealing with mental health as a musician? I find that it can be challenging to remain in a healthy place with your musicianship because we spend much of our time isolated doing repetitive tasks, and I think that can lead itself to falling into a negative headspace. So I think there are two types of mental health related issues that I've come across which come from strains related to composing. I can hear a few of my friends outside of the music world giggling at this, oh, the strain of being an artist. But these are very real stresses, and I would say to any of them, try bearing your innermost sense of self and your vulnerability to the world, and watch as either no one gives a damn or thinks you're some weird monster, and let's see how you get on. So there are two areas of this happening. There's the strain of trying to get a career going, and then the strain of what you might call early success. So let's talk about early success first, because it's kind of a nice problem to have, and that's part of the problem with it, is you don't tend to get much sympathy. But when you get some of your first big gigs or big commissions, that can be a really challenging time. And I've heard of composers from Tom Addis to James McMillan struggling, particularly around the times of their first big orchestral commissions. And that was a similar thing for me. It was my first major orchestral commission, but I had some other work that I had to get done before I got to it. So I couldn't start on this piece, which was fulfilling my life's dream, for almost a year. I've always felt that I don't mind pressure and stress, I just get on with it. I almost feel like I enjoy it. But at some point I learned that my body had other views, and I found for a couple of years around this time that I really struggled. The worst attack I had was when I was in New York for the US premiere of my chamber opera, The Firework Maker's Daughter. And I got into quite a state, I could hardly breathe, and I didn't make it to the premiere. I was really worried it was something to do with my heart, but I had it all checked out and it was fine. And in the end, the symptoms only really matched stress and anxiety. So I realised that stress releases chemicals into your body and it can affect you even if you don't immediately think you mind the stress. And these days, I try and be a bit more cautious in terms of the workload I take on. So that's all a problem of success, but perhaps the more insidious kind of stress relates to the stress of getting going in your career, because it's really difficult to get started and it's very easy to find yourself getting nowhere despite putting all of your effort into it, sometimes for years on end. I've had periods of my life like this myself, and I've known many others who've written, say, 10 pieces which have all ended up in their drawer never being performed. So at that point, do you carry on? You know, are you the genius that has just not yet been discovered? Or are you actually just a madman writing dots for no reason? That's a question that keeps haunting you. And that's where I think unpicking your motivations can be really good. I don't believe that if you really love music and you're doing it not just for reasons of glamour, that you should be able to find ways to fulfill your musical passion. It may not be the ways you envision standing on the stage at Carnegie Hall taking a bow, but there should be ways there to do it, especially these days with the internet, meaning it's so much easier to get your music out there in some form. Lucas Vignoli-Rees asks, Wintergatan David Bruce collab when? So Wintergatan, for those of you who don't know, is this fabulously mad project on YouTube to build a musical marble machine. And it's been going on now for several years and must be pretty close to completion. There's a new update every Wednesday which usually deals with some extremely specific issue, such as how to get a marble to fall in the right place of the vibraphone plate to make a good tone with a strong fundamental. So it's partly music, partly physics, but partly a sort of craftsman's channel. There's a lot of woodwork and a lot of soldering. But I think a lot of us have got caught up in the inspiring madness of spending so many years building this insane instrument, which who knows whether it will ever produce good music at the end. But Martin's spending so much care and precision over it that it feels like it's going to be something quite extraordinary and unique in music history. So Martin's planning to do a world tour with his band once the instrument's finished. And my hope is that one day after that he'll be open to the possibility of new uses for it, or getting new composers to write for it. And I'd certainly love to give it a go. So I haven't spoken to Martin, I don't know him at all, but I know the marble machine's going to be great, and one day, who knows? All I can say is, I believe. If you'd like to ask a question for a future Q&A, don't forget to follow me on Instagram or Twitter to find out when I'm next calling for questions. Thanks as ever to my patrons on Patreon for supporting the channel, and if you enjoy what I do here, do consider joining them. It really does make this channel possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.